So today we're going to be taking a look at a scenario where NATO and BRICS go to war. Now this was one of my first mapping videos, but today we're going to be revamping it and using some more knowledge that I've acquired to make it a better scenario. In the last video you guys said you wanted me to redo some of the old videos, so that's exactly what I'm doing here today. Now BRICS is an economical alliance, whereas NATO is a military alliance, so this kind of thing would never happen in real life, so we do have to acknowledge that there's going to be some unrealistic events that could take place in this video. Anyway, if you guys do enjoy it, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're still aiming for 100,000 by the end of this year. We have 2 months to do it, and I think it's still possible. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into this scenario. So I'm not sure how it started, but somehow these two alliances are now at war. And of course, this is going to be a really large global conflict with BRICS spanning across 3 different continents and then NATO spanning across 2.5. Now, of course, this is taking place in modern day, so we do have to factor in modern day events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll go ahead and throw in their current front lines, and now the war can begin. Now, at first, I'm just going to have the two alliances fighting, but eventually and inevitably, other countries are going to be getting involved, because if they didn't, this video would just be a giant stalemate. Now, I don't think NATO or BRICS could overthrow each other on their own. That's why other countries will be getting involved, so we do have a victor in this video. But for now, just one-on-one, and the only front line they actually have is in Europe, more specifically in Ukraine and the Baltics. But we do have Russian troops re-advancing into Ukrainian territory, which they have lost. And at this point, the Ukrainian counteroffensive stop as they go on defense again. Now, of course, this isn't good for Ukraine, but it's also not good for NATO, as they are still getting ready to fight back the Russians. Ukraine is currently stationed as a buffer zone, and as soon as this war started, the funding for Ukraine was completely cut, as the funding is going to go to the countries themselves. So Ukraine is just on its own right now. Up north, we also have Russia starting to invade into the Baltic states, and a push for Estonia's capital is made. In southern Ukraine, Russian troops slither around the coast and manage to capture Odessa. From here, they push up to the border of Moldova and cut southern Ukraine off from the rest of Ukraine. Luckily, Moldova does send troops into the area and manages to hold off the Russians for now. But meanwhile, up north, we have the Russians broadening this front line in the south. So at first, we have Russia jumping out from their main territory and attacking Europe. It is going well so far, but once again, Russia is invading the entire European continent, and it's going to start flipping on them pretty soon. Now, Chinese and Indian troops, I don't really know what they would do. I think India would be geared towards self-defense, and China would most likely be like splitting the troops, maybe some of them going to the Russian front line. I highly doubt Brazil or South Africa would send troops elsewhere, because they're going to have to defend themselves in this war. The US would most likely be going after these two countries, so they're going to want to, protect themselves. But for now, the US is like building up their military. They're sending some assets over to Europe, because of course Europe is going to need as much help as possible, but they're also gearing up for an invasion of Brazil. Back over in Ukraine though, we have Russian troops re-advancing in from the north and now pushing down towards Kyiv. The Ukrainian army manages to stop them from taking the city, but they do lose the northernmost part of Ukraine. Back over in the Baltics, the Russians continue to push into these 3 countries. They now enter into Lithuania and start to push over towards Latvia's capital. Russia makes another attempt to grab Tallinn, but they once again fail. But now they are close to encircling the city. With the collapse of this front line, which leads Russia to cut off Estonia from the rest of NATO, and from here we have the starvation beginning. So Russia is experiencing a lot of success in this scenario. They aren't doing bad, but also considering that they are technically the second strongest country in the world, they aren't doing necessarily good. The Baltics have little to no military, and Ukraine has been fighting a war for like 8 months now. Plus, they got their supplies cut, so they really should be pushing through Ukraine, but they're just not. But at this point, we do have some outside countries starting to get involved, but that's not before Russia manages to completely take over all of Estonia, making them the first casualty of this war. Followed by that, we have the capture of Latvia's capital. This leads to the surrender of Latvia, and now Russian troops seep into northern Lithuania. We have them connecting up with Kaliningrad, and from here, we have a stalemate being established along the Baltic and Polish front. But like I said, other countries are now going to be getting involved. Most notably, we have the NATO applicants of Finland and Sweden joining this war. These guys will really help out NATO in the northern front against BRICS. But on the other side of things, we have Belarus joining the war on the side of Russia. Now this will really help Russia on the northern Central Europe front, also the Ukrainian front. And basically Belarus is just going to be ran through by Russian troops. Belarus itself won't do much for the alliance, but they are going to be contributing a little bit. And such contributions can be seen in the Baltics, as we have Russian and Belarusian troops taking over the rest of Lithuania. From here, we have a slight advance into Poland, but this is eventually halted. Down south, we see Belarusian troops push over, and now we have Kyiv in danger. Russian and Belarusian troops make a very large campaign to take the city, and this is by far one of the most bloodiest battles of this war, but in the end, they managed to capture the city. This serves as a huge morale loss for Ukraine, as soldiers are now like kind of giving up hope, which is something you would never want to see in war. We see a risk of a ginormous encirclement starting to be made, and Ukraine is forced to revise their plans. They give up a lot of ground over here in the center, but with these new troops, they're able to push back the two spears that were about to cause an encirclement. But now even more countries are starting to get involved as more fronts are going to open up in this war. We have South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan all joining the side of NATO, and this is a huge power boost to NATO as these guys, or South Korea and Japan, are some of the strongest countries in the world. These two guys will really help out against China in the end game, but unfortunately with South Korea joining, we do see North Korea join. Now, on the topic of North Korea, let's talk about nukes. Now, in these scenarios, and if you're a longtime viewer, then you know that I never use nukes in any of these scenarios. I've only ever used nukes once, and I'm not even sure what video it was in. But yeah, I don't use nukes in these videos because conventional warfare is kind of the go-to way that I like to do my videos. It's just more entertaining. That's it's just more entertaining. But with these guys now joining in, we have the Philippines joining in, and followed by that is Australia and New Zealand. So now the front line in this war is greatly expanding. We've had a lot of people join in on the blue team, but we also have some people who are going to join in on the red team. Those countries include Iran, Mongolia, Venezuela, and Syria. Now these countries that I've just selected have close ties to the red team. Mongolia is more so just, it's easier for Russia and China to move things between each other. But Iran, Syria, and Venezuela are all close to the red team governments, so they would most likely join in this war without much risk to themselves. Of course, some countries like Nicaragua or Cuba are red team aligned, but they're not going to join in because that would just mean an immediate end by the United States. So there's a no-go there. But back over to the Middle East with Syria and Iran joining in, we have Israel being forced to pick a side, and that side is going to be the blue team. But with Israel joining, this kind of sparks Palestine and Lebanon to join in on the red team. Meanwhile, the rest of the Middle East, including Yemen, declared neutrality. Of course, this is also factoring the most recent political events with the US and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Iran, all kind of stuff like that. So this is up to date as of October 28th or October 29th when you're seeing this. But yeah, this is slowly turning into a world war. Well, it was already a world war, but let's go ahead and go back to the front lines in Europe. We have Belarus pushing in from the southern border all the way into Ukraine. From here, Russian troops force Moldova into the war on the side of the blue team, and these guys immediately push across the country and into Romania in order to flank out defensive armies in the south. They do this perfectly, and they time it perfectly as they are now in the northern gates of Bucharest. These defensive armies are forced to retreat in order to protect the capital city, and that is a huge blow towards NATO as they're about to lose one of their major cities, which once again is the capital of Romania. From here, Russian troops push over and take over the rest of Moldova, and they're now going to use Moldova as a central point in order to push over into central Ukraine, this time from the west. So this really complicates things for the Ukrainian army. They do make a slight counteroffensive in the south, going towards Odessa and Kherson, but those counteroffensives are overall stopped. We have them trying that again in the north, but that is stopped, and now Ukraine is basically out of power. But now we're gonna go ahead and hop on down to the Middle East, where we have some interesting events taking place. The first of which is actually Georgia joining the war on the side of the blue team, as well as Azerbaijan joining on the blue team, and then now we have Armenia on the red team. I was debating on whether or not Azerbaijan and Armenia would join in on this war, because honestly in real life right now they're fighting, so I don't know how that would play into the whole global conflict thing. So one way or another they would be dragged into this because Armenia is Iranian allied, and then we have Azerbaijan who is allied to Turkey. But with these guys being brought into the war, we have a quick blitz into Armenia in order to take out the government that is there. This goes pretty well considering that the country is very mountainous, but now we have a trifecta going on over here between Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. With this new organization, they push into Iran from Azerbaijan, but this is only expected to last for a couple days as the Iranian army is about to kick them back. Meanwhile, we have Turkey focusing in over here on Syria as they push down their coast. They also push into the north of the country, and Syria is prone to being collapsed anytime now. Israelis take over Palestine again, and they also push up into Lebanon and meet up with the Turks. From here, Israel manages to capture Syria's capital city, and after extinguishing some rebel groups all around, we have the collapse of Syria. So a pretty quick blitz of Syria there. Not much could have been done to really stop that because Syria is isolated. Iraq never joined this war because they don't have an interest in doing so. So overall, just a quick kill on Syria there. But with this, Turkey can now focus solely on Iran and maybe even Russia in the south. So this is really going to help out the blue team in the long run. But now let's go ahead and jump over to Asia, where we have a lot of things going on. The first of which is actually South Korea pushing up into North Korea and capturing Pyongyang. Now I know this is a bold assumption, but North Korea is not as strong as it looks. Sure, they may have like one of the most powerful armies in terms of manpower in the world, but effectiveness is close to zero. Like they can't do anything. So South Korea actually manages to gain ground here, and that is until China shows up and they're unable to advance any further. Speaking of China, we have China invading China. And in that case, we actually have China invading Taiwan, taking over Taipei and capitulating the island. Now that is a fast series of events, and it probably wouldn't happen too fast, but just to get it out of the way, Taiwan is captured by China. And let's go ahead and quickly go over why some countries are in this war compared to the last video, which was the original NATO versus BRICS. So in the last video, I most likely had Central Asia joining in, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. And the reason I don't have them included right now is because these guys are moving away from the whole Eastern mindset. Kazakhstan doesn't want anything to do with Russia. Turkmenistan really never has wanted anything to do with Russia. Uzbekistan is just there. And then Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are always fighting, so I doubt that they would join in on the same side in a war. The only country that would maybe throw in is Afghanistan, and then Pakistan is pretty much out of the question because India is on the red team. And then of course they're not going to join the blue team because why would they go up against China and Russia? So that's why those countries aren't in this war. Also in the last video, I think I had Egypt in. They're just not going to join. Them and Israel are pretty chill now, so there's no point. And then in South Africa, we actually have nobody joining in because no one wants to get invaded by South Africa. I don't even know why South Africa would want to join this war in the first place. That's why I said in the beginning that we're going to have to take some realism out, because South Africa would, I mean, what are they going to do? They're not going to invade anybody. They're just going to defend themselves. They have no interest being in this war. Same thing with Brazil. It's mainly just a war of Russia, China, and India. But once again, just for the sake of the title, they are going to have to be dragged in. But nothing's been going on over here in America. Let's go ahead and change that. Now, of course, I forgot French Guiana, but if we do factor in French Guiana at this point in time, it's completely taken over by Brazil. But now America's allies in South America are going to get involved. Those guys include Colombia, Chile, and surprisingly, Argentina. Now I say surprisingly because Argentina has some issues with Britain, and if you don't know, those are the Falkland Islands, which are these guys right here. But also because Argentina never really aligns with Colombia and Chile in my videos. I think the last time I had these three countries paired up was like the South America video where Brazil invaded the continent. But aside from that, they're almost never together. But with Chile and Argentina and the South joining in, they do manage to convince Uruguay and Paraguay to join the war, which gives them a broader front against Brazil. We have the US sending troops down to Colombia in order to take out Venezuela, and then of course try to push into the Amazon. We also have Panama joining the war because the US pressured it to do so. This will allow the US to pretty much control what goes in and out of the Panama Canal, and that is going to be a huge economical blow towards the red team. Now, of course, they could attempt to invade Egypt in order to control the Suez, but that's a war I don't think that anyone really wants to fight. It's not worth it, so let's just let it be what it wants to be. I'm also sure that NATO's navy is just like camping this side of the Mediterranean, just so like as soon as they see a red team ship go through, it's just gone. But yeah, American troops now push over into Venezuela and quickly take over the north of the country, taking their capital along the way. We then have a combined effort between both countries to take over the rest of a crippling Venezuela, and eventually we have the capturing of the entire country. From here, they start to gear up in order to invade northern Brazil, but there is a slight problem. The Amazon rainforest is ginormous and nobody wants to invade that. So what do they do about that? Well, yes, they can push in and take some cities over here in the north, but beside that, there's nowhere else to go except for the rainforest. They do manage to get Guyana to join this war simply because they had border disputes with Venezuela. That was the only thing that would like entice them to join, is settling those disputes. But Suriname does not want to budge on their neutrality. So we have the United States violating that neutrality. Never seen that before. Quickly, US troops storm into Suriname as Brazilian troops storm into the other half, and eventually we have a clashing between both sides. The US manages to have the upper hand despite being far away from home. They took over northern French Guiana in assistance with France. Eventually the entire department is liberated. Following that, we have the entire south of Suriname being liberated. They then push down the coast and go to the mouth of the Amazon. Now, I don't know if the Amazon is necessarily used for transportation of goods. I doubt it because it runs through the entire rainforest, but we're just gonna go ahead and say the blue team manages to take over control of the mouth of the Amazon. I don't know how beneficial that is to themselves, but they just do it anyway. But now we're going into territory where Brazil has the advantage, with this environment just being way more familiar towards the country. Now the US has dealt with jungles before, and we all know how that went, but this is a different US. Nonetheless, they stop invading because they have to help out Europe. Just for now though, they'll come back. But in the south, we actually do have Brazil doing some invading. They took over a little bit of Paraguay, and in addition to that, they took over a little bit of Uruguay. They took over the panhandle of Argentina, until eventually they are stopped by a growing blue team force, which will eventually push Brazil back into their own country. Now let's go ahead and hop over to Europe, where we've had some frontline changes, which are kind of going both ways. So most notably, we've actually had NATO being able to push back into Lithuania. With this, they've managed to take over all of Kaliningrad, which as of now only has 6,000 troops defending it. They then continue to push into Lithuania, pushing up and capturing the capital of Latvia, Riga. They managed to get Lithuania's capital back, and now they storm the fronts of Estonia, taking Tallinn along the way. So overall, Russia's Baltic front, which should have been really easy to hold, is collapsing. The one front for them that is not collapsing is the Ukrainian front. In fact, it's the opposite. Ukraine just sort of capitulated. They lost a majority of their country. The government is non-existent. This over here is literally just NATO troops. So now they're gonna have to figure out how to push back Russia in this scenario. Also, not just Russia at this point, also like Chinese, Indian, and Iranian troops. So NATO is really going against the whole Asia over here. Let's go ahead and head back on to the Caucasus, where we have Iran, like I said earlier, being able to push back these Azerbaijani armies. Completely ignoring geography here, we do have Turkey managing to push over into northwestern Iran. This is pretty slow because we're going to refactor in geography and say that they're having a hard time pushing through the mountains. This advance is eventually slowed down, and let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening over here in Korea. A slight South Korean advance. Not too much though, just a little bit, or enough to get China to maybe want to invade the rest of Korea. But at this point, the US Navy is knocking on China's door, and it's time for a Pacific War Part 2. While some of the US Navy is over here on the northern coast of Brazil, the majority of it, which I would say about 85% of it, is over here off the coast of China, bombarding literally everything they have. If we can't have your goods, then you can't have your goods, said someone that's running the US. China's economy takes a huge hit as many factories and industrial areas along their coast are blown to pieces. Now this could of course entice China to do the same thing to the US, but they just don't have the range to hit the continent because it's just too far away, whereas the Americans are just chilling over here in the ocean. Speaking of the US Navy chilling in the ocean, we have them retaking over Taiwan. Now Taiwan would be a major battleground of this war, as China wants it because they think it's theirs, and the US wants it because it's a very strategic location. The fact that the US has it right now is maybe temporary, but it's also a huge thing for them, as they're going to be able to bombard China even more. You didn't know we're very good at dropping napalm. Now at this point, both sides are trying to see their way out of this war. No one wants to fight it because it's just ongoing. It's an onslaught, and right now there is no clear winner. I mean, the red team's fronts are starting to go against them, so maybe they could, see that they're losing and pull out. But Russia, who is basically the leader of the pack, says no. Now they only say no because they have the most land out of anyone here. I guess if we're going in terms of land gainage, Brazil would be the other leader. Back over in Europe, we see Winter War Part 2 break out as Finland and co managed to take over the entire Kola Peninsula, following this to take over Karelia. Now this was a pretty quick invasion, and it's most likely that quick and easy because Russia isn't really defending it. They have some important intel and missile silos up here, but it doesn't really serve too much of a purpose for Russia itself. They're mainly focused on holding the Ukrainian front and also trying to hold their out in the Baltics. But as we see Finland seeping down towards St. Petersburg, Russia is... I just saved that to my main map. Well, that's unfortunate. I better hope they remember to undo this by the end of the video. But yeah, they start to seep down towards St. Petersburg, and yeah, they're just they're gonna revise their whole strategy here in the Baltics. Basically, hey, you know what? We have a lot of troops in the Baltics. Why don't we use them to defend St. Petersburg? That's a ginormous withdrawal from the Baltics, and China and India are like, why did you do that? Well, of course, to protect St. Petersburg, but they just left Belarus vulnerable in the north. And NATO sees that, and NATO takes upon an opportunity. NATO troops slam into northern Belarus, causing Russia to say, oh, I managed to capture the capital city of Minsk within weeks, and with that, Belarus surrenders. Yeah, their government got overthrown by everybody, And that's just really unfortunate for Russia. Now, of course, with Belarus's surrender, the armed forces which are in Ukraine simply disappear, and that even leads to Kyiv being unoccupied by anybody. Now, NATO troops race down towards the city in order to stop Russia from retaking it, but unfortunately, Russia does get there before NATO does. But we are left with a pretty interesting front line that looks like this over here in northern Ukraine. So while yes, Russia has a protected front over here against NATO, their entire ally and gateway to Europe is gone. And on top of that, they're not going to have to reinforce the Belarusian border, which is showing signs of uh-oh as NATO troops seep into the country. Yep, that backfired for Russia, and now we even see Georgia invading them, because that's possible apparently. Also important to mention, this is a combined effort between Georgia, Turkey, and Israel. So no, it's not just Georgia invading them. But those are some pretty powerful countries right there, so they do some damage. Romania finally snaps out of it and pushes Russia out of their country, with the recapturing and liberation of Odessa, the entire liberation of Moldova. With this, BRICS starts to look at Russia with uncertainty as the country is facing losses to countries which it should not be facing losses to. Such countries include Georgia, Romania, Moldova, and now a re-liberated Ukraine. Back over in South America, we have the Southern Blue team pushing the Brazilians out of their country, and using some handy-dandy US support, they push into Brazil and capture some major cities which are located in the south. This includes Rio de Janeiro eventually, and Brasilia, which is actually in a pretty good location, is starting to rethink their alliance here with the red team. Of course, they were forced into this war, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have to be forced out of the war by the red team. And by that I mean Brazil just surrenders. That's a huge sigh of relief for the United States and of course everyone else in South America. But it's not too good for Russia, China, and India, who are they're not happy about this. This just leaves the US to send all their troops over to Europe and Asia. And with that happening, we have the turn of the tide of the war, and basically the beginning of the end for the red team. Seeing Brazil surrender, we have South Africa surrendering. Now, they did nothing in this video, and that's because they do nothing in real life. I think that's just a fair point to throw out there. But now it's just the blue team versus the red team. Well, that's what it's been the entire video, but it's just NATO and Co versus Asia. Iran manages to push back Turkey, but we have the opposite going up against Russia in the south. The liberation of Kyiv is achieved, and then from here we have a giant sweep through the center of Ukraine, all the way down into Crimea and on the border of Donbass. This striking sweep through Russia causes a lot of unrest in Russia, and this country is about to go through a civil war. Except this is going to be a short-lived civil war, as someone puts a nice lead bullet into the leader of Russia, also known as an assassination. Now, conveniently, it's not just him that gets the bullet, it's also everyone else that would lead up to the power until eventually a civilian government is put into place, and this civilian government basically just stops the advance of any Russian troops. And with the stop of advance, they also stop the defense somehow, and this leads to Ukraine being liberated. Basically, a bunch of civilians who don't know what they're doing are running the country of Russia until eventually we have the more liberal and Western Russians taking over and basically just pulling Russia out of this war. They comply with NATO ultimatums and eventually leave the war, which actually is not good for the red team if you didn't know. So with Russia being pulled out of the war by its own people, Mongolia, China, India, and Iran are forced to rethink their position here. Now, of course, they aren't necessarily a bad one. They have a lot of good borders here. They have a lot of defense between China and India, and they only really have to do is push back Korea and they can stalemate the war. Iran, on the other hand, might get squeezed out eventually, but at this point, it's pretty much over. Everyone knows that if they try to advance, it'll just be a stalemate. North Korea just capitulated somehow, and that's basically going to seal the deal here for the red team. So we have both sides meeting up and deciding to sign up a peace treaty, which won't even hurt India, China, or Mongolia, but of course the rest of the red team is going to be hurt. So let's go ahead and take a look at said peace treaty. Alright, let's go ahead and break down this peace treaty. So starting off in the Americas, we have the division of Brazil and Venezuela by the United States and allies. Colombia gets a big chunk of land out of both Venezuela and Brazil, and then we have going along the northern coast here, we have Guyana and French Guiana splitting Suriname, and then we have France itself gaining some coast along the northern coast of Brazil. Most notably, we have the United States taking a big hunk of land out of Brazil. Now, I'm not sure why they would do this and what reason they would serve, but I do have a feeling that this kind of thing would happen. Maybe not this piece of land in particular, But you know, in wars in history in the past, we have seen countries just take chunks out of other countries for themselves. So this is just kind of what's happened here. Going further south, we see Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay all got land from southern Brazil. Nothing too notable, but let's go ahead and move on to Europe. Now, Europe also doesn't have too many changes to it, but of course there are still some notable ones. Starting off, we have Finland annexing all of the Kola Peninsula and Karelia, and then going to Estonia, we have them getting up and rubbing up against St. Petersburg.
Can I be in your video?
No. This is just kind of leverage for NATO to maybe quickly push over and capture St. Petersburg should a war ever break out again. Latvia and Lithuania get land, and then we have Poland getting land from Kaliningrad, which is split by Lithuania and Poland. Belarus is just split up between everyone bordering them. Ukraine is very happy. Going on south, we have Georgia getting South Ossetia and Abkhazia back, and then we also have them getting land out of Armenia. Armenia itself does not exist anymore. Turkey gets land out of Iran. Turkey gets land out of Syria, and then we have Israel getting all of Lebanon and southern Syria. Jumping on over to Asia, we have our final change here, which is South Korea annexing all of North Korea. Now, when the civilians took over Russia and declared peace, one of the ultimatums was Japan getting back all of their claims. So we have them getting back all of Sakhalin and their islands, the Kareli Islands? Not the Kareli, the Kuril Islands. So I was close on the K there. Pretty sure the Kareli Islands are in India. But they get all their claims back over here in the Pacific, and that makes them very happy. Taiwan gets their independence, which they already had, but recognized independence. And overall, this is a pretty big win for the blue team until, of course, another war breaks out, because we can't have one major conflict without another one following suit. We saw that with World War I in 1914 and World War II in 1939. Not much of a window there. So yeah, I'd imagine a few years later we would have China going up against the rest of the world or something like that. Russia broke into a civil war during the peace deal. I'm not going to highlight it because I don't want to, but do note that is happening. And yeah, so that's going to do it for this NATO versus BRICS video. If you guys did enjoy it, please make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you're new. I don't know what to say that's new and unique when it comes to getting your guys' support, so just show some support if you enjoyed the video. If you watched it all the way through, that means you must have liked it, because this is probably like a 20-minute video. Yeah, so you sat through this video 20 minutes? You're gonna tell me you didn't enjoy it? Why not show some support? You know, 100K is a pretty big number, and if I saw someone wanting to get 100K and I watched their entire video, I would subscribe to them. But aside from that stuff, thank you guys once again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.